Goods markets, also problematic. Any measures, for example, regulatory measures which increase production costs, cause a loss of competitiveness, both in the domestic market against imports and in export markets. That will reduce employment, and it would also have balance of payments effects. But before you say, so what, it will affect the balance of payments, remember, in a steady state economy, we can't borrow money, so we can't run a budget, a balance of payments deficit. In principle, we could offset that by using import restrictions. Except you can't do that because of the European Union and the WTO. And I've pressed the wrong button again. Don't want to disappoint you too much, but I won't actually be using that graph this evening. Unless you ask the right question. Where did I get to? Constraints. Yeah. Okay, so constraints. Basically, globalization, the process of globalization, locks us into an economic model that I would argue is incompatible with a steady state economy. This has been a conscious and deliberate policy choice over the last 30 years. We could, in principle, opt out at least of some parts of these, but this would stop us from promoting a global steady state economy, which is much more important. Problem 5, knock-on effects. As well as locking us into this system, globalization, again as a matter of conscious, deliberate policy choice, has made the South critically dependent on exports, and particularly on exports to the North. Having developed that critical dependency, if we now just say, okay, we're going to stop growing, we're going to stop importing, particularly if we shift towards localization as well, you take away the major source of development. And that would have serious effects on poverty, and on, through poverty, on environmental damage and on conflict. The humanitarian impacts would be potentially very serious. Of course, we could just ignore 86% of the world, at least in the short term. But, as I said, the North is solely responsible for climate change. That is not in any way an exaggeration, is not hyperbole. The North has 15% of the world's population. It has 63% of historical emissions since the mid-18th century. The accumulated emissions over the last 250 years. 63% are from the North. Much of the emissions in the South, of course, will have occurred under colonial rule, when essentially they were emitting on our behalf, or our elites in India, in Kenya, in what was then Rhodesia, in wherever, were largely responsible even for the southern emissions. Emissions in the North over that period, since the mid-18th century, have been 25 times what they were in the South. If we had emitted no more than the South had, climate change would not be an issue, certainly for centuries, possibly ever. Climate change is entirely the fault of northern overconsumption. Issue 1. Second, the North has deliberately created the dependency which is locking the South into dependence on our growth. It's because we have done that that they will be wrecked if we just turn the taps off. So our position in ignoring the development issue is untenable, and not just morally, but also politically. We need a global steady state economy, not just in the North, not just in the UK. But if we just ignore this issue, we lose any chance of Southern support or even acquiescence. Even with Northern support, we lose legitimacy, because we can then only impose this through undemocratic processes, as we have imposed globalization, as we imposed colonialism. This is not a good basis for anything. We lose the moral high ground, we will lose much of civil society. Okay, so that brings us on to a global steady-state economy. So, why do we need a global steady-state economy? Well, globalization makes it almost impossible now to treat national economies separately and in isolation. The greatest environmental problems are global, through unsustainable global exploitation of global global ecosystems, and especially in climate change. Climate change is inherently global. It is the global total emissions which affect the overall global climate. No country can opt out of it just by reducing its own emissions. On climate change especially, technological options are not enough. As I said, we need to reduce emissions per unit of output by something well over 95% over probably the next, at most 40 years, probably a lot less than that now. The technological options just aren't, that we know about, that we have thought of so far or can anticipate, just are not enough to do that. And as we've seen with the effect of a very small shift towards biofuels, in terms of pushing up the foods, the prices of basic foods like rice and maize, a lot of the technological options that we think we do have potentially very serious limitations or serious side effects. But until we actually put them into action, then we won't find out. Just as another example, I mean, the nuclear, there's a whole lot of issues around nuclear energy, of course. One of which is that there's a very high carbon content in any case in nuclear energy. But the other question is the supply of nuclear materials. At present, everyone is saying, yes, we've got enough to last for centuries. Yes, we have, as long as it only generates 0.5% of global energy. If you shift to 10% even, which is a drop in the ocean of what we need to do, then you're multiplying your consumption of the inputs that you need by 20. And you're cutting the period that the existing resources would last by a factor of 20. So you're probably bringing it within the life of a new power station. So it's not at all clear that the numbers add up. Anyway, that's a digression. I shouldn't be digressing because I'm running. Okay. So should we seek a global steady-state economy in the sense of no overall global economic growth? Yes, we should. And northern national steady-state economies are a key part of that. But if we're going to have if we're going to stabilize our overall level of global output and consumption at a sustainable level, then that is substantially less than what we are producing and consuming now. As I said, if you use the ecological footprint methodology, we're currently, as a global society, consuming 40% more than the Earth's biocapacity. So the overall level of consumption needs to come down and then to be stabilized. But we need to deal with the environmental problems which are created by poverty, as well as those which arise from overconsumption. The majority of the world's population is living below, in terms of the dollar, the so-called dollar a day line, which is no longer a dollar a day, about half the world's population is living below $2.50 per day at purchasing power parity, which in principle, at least, and there's lots of problems with it, but in principle it means that it's equivalent to living in the UK on $2.50 a day. Now think for a minute what it would mean to live in the UK on $2.50 a day. Then think half of humanity is living on less than that. Then think we've got to cut consumption by 40% from that level. It's, it's just not going to work, is it? So if we're going to eradicate the environmental problems associated with poverty, as well as those associated with overconsumption, then we need to raise the incomes of the poor majority while reducing the overall level of consumption. That means massive global redistribution. It means right-sizing of economies, bringing the high-income economies down to a level where their overall consumption is sustainable, while raising the consumption level of the poorest to an adequate level. And it also means considerable reductions in inequality within countries. Could we? Well, it depends. Who are we? This, of course, isn't specified in the title. If we are the global community, the world population as a whole and its institutions, yes, we could. Take a little while. But acting together, it would be technically feasible. The main constraints are political, they're not practical. Yes, we would need to develop a new economics. Some of the components of that, I think, are probably out there, but there's some way to go. But I think what the last 30 years especially tells us, it is that the economics follows the politics. The whole free market experiment, globalization, neoliberalism, didn't come about because of a shift in the economics, it came about because of a shift in the politics. If the politics shifted, the economics could then follow. Clearly, economics also affects politics, but in terms of the sort of intellectual trend, the dominant paradigm of economics is driven by the politics. The obstacles are political. There are big, big losers. The whole corporate sector, the better off in the north, which probably includes most people in this room, southern elites. They're a minority, they're a relatively small minority, but they are an extremely powerful minority. Each of those groups, southern elites probably the least so, but they essentially run the world. And political and governance systems, through various mechanisms, formal and informal, entrench that economic power rather than offsetting it. Through, the global level, through weighted voting systems in the IMF and the World Bank, for example, through the the form of negotiation processes in the WTO, but also at the national level, through party and campaign finance, through lobbying, through social networks, through revolving doors, through corporate-owned media. There are all of these interconnected mechanisms through which those groups can turn their economic power into political power. There's also a free rider problem, because the benefits to each country from a steady state economy really arises from other countries having steady state economies. It's because everyone else's environmental footprints are reduced that the global environment is improved, and that benefits everyone. So for each individual country, the best option is for everyone else to have a steady state economy while they continue growing like mad and to follow a market system. And that is further reinforced by the fact that if a country, if everyone were running a steady state economy except for one country, all of the money would flow into that country because that's where they can make more profits. So that reinforces the mechanism. So it's, there's a serious free rider problem that it probably doesn't pay, certainly in terms of the interest of the elites, for anyone to actually be the first mover, for anyone to become a steady state economy.